Well, welcome back, folks, and as you saw from that little intro clip, I did get the Ford 8N running after doing the complete valve job. I would like to tell you that it started right up and I had no issues, and that wouldn't be the case. I did have some issues getting it started, and we'll come back to that and I'll fill you in on the details in a moment. But before we get to that, a couple other things I wanted to talk about. One, I couldn't run the engine very long today. You saw me start it. That was a cold start, by the way. The engine, or the machine's been sitting for 2 days in the shop, and that was cold start. I have not run it for 2 days, and so it started right up as you saw, and it actually runs really good. I can't run the engine very long right now because it's very cold outside. It's 6 degrees above zero F. It's what, minus 14 C, something like that, windy. In fact, you might even hear the garage doors creaking a little bit in the wind, and it's snowing. So I did crack the door a few minutes ago, right after I started the tractor, just to let a little fresh air in, and then I closed it right back up again because obviously I'm not attempting to heat the outside elements. Nonetheless, I am going to have to touch up some of the head bolts there from torquing of the cylinder head back to the block. I torqued those to 65 foot-pounds. The spec is 65 to 70. I'll run the engine eventually. It'll be a while, but I'll run the engine, an hour or two, get it good and hot, and then I'll go back through and check the torque again. The conduit right there, you can see it goes across the top of the block. That's unpainted. That wiring conduit carries the wiring, the lead to the top of the distributor, the yellow wire over there, and carries the spark plug wires from the distributor back to the individual plugs, and it also carries the wires to the generator. That conduit goes right over the top of a couple of the bolts, which made it very tricky to torque them down from above. And let me zoom in there just a little bit for you. This conduit was a little bit mangled. How this happens, again, is beyond me. Talked about this before. Bubba gets in here and starts messing around. But this one on the right, the standoff right here that you can just see, I'll get my hand out of the way in a second so the camera can focus, was quite mangled. This one not quite as bad. So I straightened them out a little bit. In fact, the ring at the bottom that the bolt goes through on the one on the right is tore, so I'm going to have to eventually take that off again, which I would do when I refresh the wiring anyway, or rewire the whole thing. I'll take that conduit off, and I'll probably paint it at that time and see if I can't straighten it out a little bit more, and I'll probably repair, weld up that torn metal. It's very lightweight. Now, the one thing I'm curious about, and any of you on this video that have dealt with these tractors before, I'm not sure the way that conduit lays right now, how you're supposed to tighten those head bolts without flexing that conduit back and forth to allow access from above, which is essentially what I had to do, and that's maybe what Bubba did, and in the process he mangled it. I don't know, but it seems a little bit like a poor design to me, at least given what I've got on my machine. But we'll get around it. I got around it for the first phase here, and that is to get the engine running, but eventually I'm going to have to repair, I think, this conduit, especially the standoffs here that are a little damaged. So that was a little bit of a struggle getting the conduit and getting the head bolts torqued, but we figured it out. Everything else went together really easily. I had no problems with the exhaust system, getting the carburetor back, the manifold. Let's talk about what happened in me trying to get this started. Silly me, I'm thinking, make sure it's got fuel. Make sure, I went over everything 2 or 3 times, choked it, cranked it, battery is charged, and, just cranked and cranked and cranked. It popped twice, right away. It popped twice, and then nothing. It just cranked. So I thought, it popped, but it didn't start. double checked everything, the fuel. I could tell here because of the, let me zoom back for you a little bit. I could tell I have clear fuel line right here, so I knew fuel had flown into the float bowl. I knew that it was charged with fuel. So I'm thinking, well, you need three things for an engine to run. Compression, which I'm pretty sure I've got now. Fuel, I think I've got now. And spark, I should have now. Note the operative word should there. I didn't take anything apart except for what was necessary to get the head off the engine. So obviously the manifold, carburetor and such came off. I had to get the generator out of the way because I wanted to work on the governor. And of course that conduit we just talked about and the yellow power feed that goes to the points. I had to disconnect everything at this end. And so I'm thinking, well, you know, maybe there's something wrong with ignition, but it didn't seem likely. So one thing I discovered years ago, an easy way to check quickly is if you've got either a fueling problem or an ignition or spark problem, is use a little ether. Because if you've got spark, ether, starting fluid, quick start, whatever your term is that you use for starting fluid will almost always, if there's spark, make the engine pop at least. It might even fire a little bit for a second or two. So gave her a little sniff of ether right there, or starting fluid, and nothing. It didn't work at all. So I thought, that suggests an ignition problem. So I went and I pulled the spark, one of the spark plugs, I think I pulled number 2, and checked the plug and smelled it. It smelled of fuel. By the way, those spark plugs were cleaned. I cleaned them all, regapped them, those are the originals, and put them back in. I will eventually, I will eventually replace those with new, but I cleaned them up and put them right back, so I wasn't thinking it was the spark plugs. But the spark plugs did smell, the one I pulled smelled of fuel. But it wasn't wet, so it wasn't flooded. I was pretty sure the engine wasn't flooded at that point. But I knew that I was pretty sure, I should say, that fuel was getting into the cylinder. So then I thought I'm going to test for spark. And so what I did is I used this inline spark plug tester. Most of you are probably familiar with this. And you plug this end into the spark plug boot, and you plug the other end or put it on the spark plug, and you should see spark in here when you turn over the engine. That's an easy, real easy way to test for spark. So again, I used cylinder number 2, and I hooked up the spark tester and no spark. And I thought, that's curious. The only thing I had disconnected again was over at the distributor when I had to get the conduit out of the way. So I went back and double checked all those connections, made sure they're in the right order. You know, the firing order 1, 3, 4, and 2, I believe is a firing order on this engine. Double checked all of that. Everything was in place. So I was getting ready to do, some more serious diagnosis with a multimeter and step back and say, okay, what's going on here? Thinking it was probably where I'd been fiddling around up front, pulling and reattaching the wires. And I just sat down here for a minute and thought, well, what have I done besides that? In other words, why would this engine not have spark? Battery's good, wires are connected, everything's in order, spark plugs are clean, everything's been reconnected, etc. Because I really attempted not to do anything more than what was necessary to get at the valves and get the valve work done. I've shared this with you before. I don't want to get ahead of myself, start making too many changes, because if something does go wrong, you've got too many things to try to backtrack and undo to figure out what happened. So I literally just sat here like I quite often do and looked at it and thought, well, what could have gone wrong, or where am I at? I was getting ready to do the diagnosis with my multimeter and checking for power to the points and all that. And something occurred to me. So let me reposition the camera so I can give you a better view of what ultimately I discovered. We're on the opposite side of the tractor looking back at the dash. That's what this is right here, the back of the dashboard. You can see the operator seat is right there. When I was a little bit in between steps here a week or so ago, I don't remember if I was waiting for parts or whatever, but I wasn't quite ready to put the cylinder head back on. I thought, well, as I'm preparing for the next step here, which is once I get the I was thinking once I got the cylinder head on, get the engine running again, and get that done, I'll move on to refreshing all the wiring, which I've talked about several times. And one of my thoughts was, well, I was going to check this resistor, and there's a resistor right here on the back of this dash that is intended to limit the current going to the points. And you can buy those all over replacements, but I was curious whether that resistor was still good. So I got out my multimeter, because there's a specification of, I think, I could be wrong in this without referencing the specifications again, but I think it's supposed to be 0.6 ohms, something like that. And I couldn't get the ohm meter to pick up on, get a good connection to pick up anything, because this is very rusty and it's been painted over and the wiring is all chopped up, as you can see, and wires are hanging down. You know, Bubba's been in here clearly, and that yellow wire is the one that goes to the points, which is not original. And I couldn't get a good connection to my multimeter. So what I ended up doing is scraping off a couple of the terminals on the resistor so I could get a read with my multimeter. And what I discovered is there's some nuts in there, little tiny nuts. I don't know if they're, what size they're, 5/16, something like that. And the wiring, literally, I could move the wiring on the studs. Ultimately, I did get a read on the resistor, and I think it is good, but that's really not my point here. That's how I got to this, but the resistor, I think, is fine. But I had to wiggle the wires there a little bit to get a good connection for my multimeter, and I went on my way. Once I got a reading for the resistor, I thought, okay, I know where that's at. Factor that into my plans in the future for pulling all this wiring out and replacing it with all new. And that occurred to me when I was doing my thinking through, is why won't the engine run? And it's acting like it's not getting power. So I came back over here and I just literally grabbed these wires and moved them. And I had snugged up, by the way, the little nuts to make sure that those wires weren't loose. And so I came over here and just wiggled them a little bit and went back around and used the tester, the spark tester, like I just showed you, and bingo, I had good spark on cylinder number 2. So I put the plug back in, and she cranked like twice and started right up. So the moral of that story is the wiring back here, not very good. It's pretty sketchy. I knew that from the get-go. I've shared that before, that it needs to be rewired completely, which is going to be the next step. But that knocked me off my game just a little bit, because I was thinking, why would this be? But now we know it was an issue of a connection right here. And I'm not sure which one, because I kind of wiggled them all, and it started and I left it alone. It ran, and I was more concerned at that point of trying to get the engine settled down and make sure it ran good. I did run it for probably 5-6 minutes the other day when I first started it, because the weather was warm enough I could open the door to do that. It certainly is not warm enough for that today. Later this spring, once the weather breaks and I can take the tractor outside, or we get a really nice day that I can just open the door in the shop here, I'll run it long enough that I can get it good and hot. And somewhere out there in the future, I'll do a recheck of the compression to see where the current compression is on the engine. And of course, you should do that with the engine hot. So that'll be coming up. And of course, I'll also retorque the head bolts like we talked about earlier, and make sure everything is the way it's supposed to be. But I think we're good right now, and it starts up and runs fine. One other thing I wanted to share with you is a viewer asked how I held the lifters, or prevented the lifters from turning when I adjusted the valve lash, because there's a technique to that, and there's a couple ways you can go about it. So what we're going to do is go over to the bench, and I'll give you a little more detail about how I accomplished securing those lifters so they didn't turn when I adjusted. Shot right here is a close-up of a lifter. This is a piece, of course, you adjust. The valve sits above it here and goes up into the block. So you have to turn this bolt to increase or decrease the lash, which would be right here. In the top of this lifter, there are 5 or 6 holes that are drilled around the perimeter, something like that. I don't remember exactly the count, but it's around 5 or 6. And here at this bottom shot, you can see the valve chamber. And you can see the towers where the lifters fit right here, fit right down into those. And then of course they go up and down as actuated by the cam, which fits underneath here and spins. I know this isn't a great shot, but I think you can get the gist of it from this view. So let's go over the computer and I'll show you what Ford's solution originally was for securing these lifters. Because as you turn this, the issue is as you turn this bolt, the whole lifter wants to turn, wants to pivot. And the purpose of those holes in the top of the lifter are to provide a means to prevent that from happening. A modern replacement for the lifter tool that originally was supplied by Ford. There's a left and a right-hand version, depending on which way you were turning the lifter to affect your adjustment. You can see a little protrusion here on each one of them I'm pointing to that fit into one of those holes on the top of the lifter I referenced a few minutes ago. And then this half moon shape or cutout fit around a companion lifter to the left or right side of the valve you're trying to adjust to prevent locking in place and prevent the lifter from turning. These are available today aftermarket. You can get them on Amazon, almost any tractor supply outfit that supplies parts for the Ford 8N series. The N series tractors has these available. My understanding is some of the aftermarket units aren't very heavy in terms of the build quality, and they bend. I couldn't speak to that because I didn't use this technique. And they're available relatively inexpensively. I think they're around, I don't know, 18, 20, 22 US dollars a set, something like that. But I took a different approach, which I'll share with you in just a second. But I did want to share this with you, that this special tool is still available and is still used in some cases. Another technique to prevent this from rotating as you tighten this bolt, or loosen it, as the case may be, is to drill holes right here in these towers. And I don't know, 3/16, something like that, 1/4 inch, maybe even a little smaller, but some folks will drill a hole right here in the tower, and then they can put something into that hole, and that will then go into this lifter, this cutout in the lifter, and then would lock the lifter and prevent it from turning. I considered that approach, but frankly I wasn't real wild about drilling holes in these towers. I prefer not to modify if I can help it. So even though that is a viable option apparently, it's not one I choose to pursue, so I took a whole different route. So I came across a drawing online where someone had made these little devices right here. One's a right, one's a left. They're not identical, of course, because I hand fabricated these. And the idea is that you fit this protrusion here, right here, I'm pointing with my finger, into the hole in the lifter, and then this section here fits down into the valley between the lifters and catches in between these towers. That's the idea. And this was the first one I made here. I took a piece of 3/16 drill rod, heated it cherry red, and just bent it. And it didn't take very long. It took a couple of minutes. This one is a little bit bigger here than what, width-wise, than what I would have preferred, and probably a little bit too long in this dimension. So my second one, that's this one, actually came out almost perfect. Both of them worked, and I did use both of them to adjust the valves, lifters in this tractor. And it was homemade and it worked fine. So that's what I decided to use. And again, I'm not the originator of the idea. Someone else posted some drawings online. I found them in my travels and decided to try to duplicate with some drill rod, and voila, it worked. That's going to be it for this video today, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.